Hello, and welcome back to another episode recap where I'll lay out 5 things that I learned from my conversation with a historical expert. Today, we're recapping the conversation that I had with Dr. Clayborne Carson about the historical accuracy of Selma. Dr. Carson is the founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Now, if you haven't had the time to listen to my full interview with Dr. Carson yet, well, that's why I'm here today in this video to recap 5 things I learned about the historical accuracy of the movie Selma with Dr. Carson. So let's get started. Number 1, voter rights. Dr. Carson did an excellent job of explaining the whole purpose behind the Selma campaign, but let me see if I can give a quick overview. There were a number of barriers to voting that white voters in Alabama used to keep black people from being able to register to vote. One example of that was something called the literacy test. Basically, that test was completely up to the judgment of the voting registrar. So they could use it to ask something absolutely no one would know the answer to off the top of their head, like asking someone to explain a very specific clause in the state constitution. As Dr. Carson told me, this test was used as a barrier to vote. Very few white people failed the literacy test. Well, a lot of black people failed it because they were trying to pass the test of a white person who doesn't want them to vote. Number 2, Dr. King at Bloody Sunday. One of the historical inaccuracies in the movie that Dr. Carson pointed out to me was how the film tries to explain Dr. King's absence at the march we now know as Bloody Sunday. That's when so many were tear-gassed and beaten by the state troopers on, well, a Sunday. While the movie was correct to show King not being there, the reason for his absence in the movie is tied to a recording that shows up trying to pin an affair on Dr. King. So he has to go home to talk to his wife, Coretta, and that's why he's not in Selma that day. Dr. Carson did say there was a note and a recording that supposedly had Dr. King in a compromising situation, but that came in January of 1964. The Selma marches were in March of 1964. So the real reason Dr. King wasn't there was because, well, it was a Sunday, and Dr. King was a minister, and he decided that he needed to preach at his church back in Atlanta. There was no way anyone could have known one of the biggest events in the decade would happen when the rest of the activists decided to march that Sunday. Number 3, Jimmy Lee Jackson. The movie shows a murder at the hands of the state troopers, and it happens during a night protest. When the state troopers show up to break up the protest with force, Jimmy Lee Jackson, his wife, and father-in-law duck into a nearby restaurant to hide. Before long, the troopers enter the restaurant and immediately start beating Cager Lee, Jimmy's father-in-law. When Jimmy tries to get them to stop, one of the officers pulls a gun and shoots Jimmy point blank. While Dr. Carson told me he's heard different versions of the story that say it was Jimmy's mother that he was trying to protect, the core essence of what we see in the movie is pretty much what happened. Oh, and it happened in Marion, Alabama, and not Selma, by the way. But it was the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson at the hand of the troopers that many considered a spark bringing activists to Selma that would ultimately lead to the march to Montgomery. Number 4, support from the White House. While I was watching the movie, I got the sense that President Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, wanted to support Dr. King and the protesters in Selma, but he wanted to do it in his own way and on his own time. I got the sense that there was some confliction there on the part of LBJ. Dr. Carson dove into a lot of great detail about the political side of things and how the events in Selma affected our politics even today. For example, before the 1960s, the strength of the Democratic Party was in the South, while the Republican Party relied on votes from the North. That pretty much flipped to what we see now, where the South tends to vote Republican. In fact, Dr. Carson pointed out that the Deep South has not carried the election for the Democratic Party since LBJ's landslide victory in 1964. Number 5, addressing 2020. Although we spent most of our time chatting about the history behind the movie, of course, there were way too many ties to what happened in the 1960s and what we're seeing even this year, 2020. The murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson at the hands of the state troopers sparking protests and the George Floyd protests that we've seen this year, even down to the terminology. In the movie, the troopers are talking about dominating the protesters, a term that we've heard this year too. Dr. Carson pointed out that, actually, you know what? I know this is a recap, but I thought Dr. Carson did such a great job explaining the history of what happened before, during, and around the Selma marches and how they relate to the events today that I won't even try to paraphrase it. Here's what he had to say when I asked him about the relevance of the movie's message and how it relates to what's going on today.
There's a lot of relevance to what's going on right now. I think what we see is that the movement to make America a better country, I'm talking about the long sweep of history from the abolitionist struggles of the 19th century to the present. There's always the possibility when you mobilize a movement to bring about massive social change, you're going to disrupt the society as it is. And the question is, what is the response to that disruption? Is it turning voters to support law and order? Which this is a phrase that really becomes current during the 1960s. George Wallace, for example, after this setback in Alabama, where he's kind of overwhelmed by the force of this protest, he can't stop it. It ultimately leads to the Voting Rights Act. But George Wallace runs in the primaries in '64 and does well in northern states. And by the end of the 1960s, he's a pretty serious candidate. One of the reasons why he's not any more popular is that by that time, Richard Nixon has switched to the Southern strategy. Nixon makes this calculated move by watching Wallace. And he's saying that the reason why Wallace is not more serious as a presidential candidate is that he's too out front with his racism. And Wallace recognizes that. By the late 1960s, he's kind of moderated his racism to some degree. But Nixon does it first and does it better, more convincingly, that I'm simply for law and order. He learns that from Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew is, you could have a film about the clash between Spiro Agnew and A-Trap Brown in 1967. A-Trap Brown, by that time, it's known as a Black Power speaker, comes to Cambridge, Maryland, gives a Black Power speech. After he leaves town, there's some rioting that goes on in Cambridge. And Spiro Agnew comes to there and says, we need to crack down on these militant Black leaders. And he's going to put A-Trap Brown in jail and throw away the key. And he demands that other Black leaders condemn him. So at that point, Spiro Agnew is a newly elected governor, unknown nationally. Within a year, he's vice president of the United States. Maybe a little bit more than a year and a half. He's vice president of the United States. And interestingly, he would have become president of the United States because by the time Nixon is thrown out of office, Spiro Agnew is himself thrown out because he was, at the same time, the law and order politician was taking bribes right in the vice presidential office and got caught. So if he had been able to control his greed a bit while he was vice president, he would have become president. So that kind of shows the power of that. So when I think of today, isn't that the question? Which massive protests can bring the country to the point of you have to pay attention to this issue. But once the nation pays attention to the issue, well, what are they going to decide to do? They can decide to say, let's make the problem go away, or let's make the protest go away. And those are the two basic options that I think Americans always have. And we'll be seeing that in this year's election and elections to come, because I think that this is something ingrained in the racial politics of the United States, that if Black people push hard to correct the injustices of the past, there's always the danger that you're going to feed law and order politics and white fears and resentments. So the question is, how do you push for what you want and what you need and what you deserve, but at the same time not get a more reactionary response? Because I think that it is very interesting that even though we've had some, the Democratic Party has become somewhat liberal, but certainly more liberal than the Republican Party. But since the 60s, it's never really succeeded in gaining the majority of the white vote. So that prediction of Johnson has held true, that what he did in the mid-1960s cost the Democratic Party white support going into the 21st century.
That's all for today, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode recap of 5 things that I learned from Dr. Clayborne Carson about the historical accuracy of the movie Selma. Now, my chat with Dr. Carson was about an hour long, so we talked about a lot more than just the things I brought up in this video, and he went into a lot of great depth. You can listen to that whole interview for free right now over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/167. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/167. And if you want to learn more about the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., go check out the fantastic resources from the King Institute, including Dr. Carson's own podcast called the World House Podcast. In the meantime, for more recaps and full-length episodes of Based on a True Story, hit that subscribe button right now. Thanks for watching.